Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here. This is what Lady Macbeth says to the spirits of the night while she's looking for strength to kill King Duncan. These lines were written in an age when one of history's most powerful monarchs was a queen who shunned both motherhood and marriage, and who by some accounts did her best to make herself as masculine as she could in her society. I think this line shows the extent to which women had lost even the reputation of taking a leading role in affairs since the time of the early church. I think there are two factors that have largely contributed to this loss of status. The devaluation of martyrdom as an explicit goal for believers, and the rise of the institutional church hierarchy. But regardless, I think it's also accurate to say that early Christian women never actually had the recognition or authority equal to that of men, even if they did have more than other groups of women. As some background, of course, there is recognition of women having authority and influence in the early church. As McCulloch points out, St. Paul mentions women in leadership roles. There's Prisca, who with her husband was a missionary. There's Phoebe, who was a leader in the church near Corinth. Certainly the Gospels accord women some significant roles. For example, there's some significant and overt examples of devotion. Mary of Bethany washing Jesus' feet. The women who were the only ones present at the crucifixion and the tomb. There's also great examples of faith shown by women. The woman with the effusion of blood, who believes that she only needs to touch the hem of Christ's garment in order to be healed. And one of my favorites is the Canaanite woman who dares to argue with Jesus about why he should bestow healing on her daughter. Many men in the gospel seem to shy away from these sorts of overt displays. We've got the rich man who does not give away everything he owns and goes away sad, I think implying that he doesn't intend to give away much of anything. And of course culminating with Peter and his denial of Jesus. So the first thing that I think was an influence in decreasing any power that women had started to gain in the early church was martyrdom being diminished as a specific goal for believers. In Young and in the story of Perpetua, women martyrs become elites. This near deification granted to all people at the time was expected of all believers. And women became valued participants and revered protectors of the living after they had died. The martyr Irene and her fellow martyrs even receive what Young calls, quote, direct communication from God, which determined the pattern of women's lives. And Perpetua is granted a vision, which is similar to Jacob of the ladder, and St. John Climacus, whose ladder of divine ascent is one of the signature icons of the Eastern Church. Both of these, hers and St. John's ladder, being fraught with peril on our ascent to heaven. So martyrdom was at the time, for a while, a sort of a social leveler. Correspondingly, as martyrdom became less of a prospect, as Christianity was more accepted and persecutions diminished, the names of women taper off precipitously in the records of the faith. Which leads me to reason two, a second cause of the influence of women being diminished, the rise of the church hierarchy. As the normalization of Christianity into everyday life occurred, the norms of everyday life in all other areas also began to reassert themselves in the lives of Christians. For example, McCulloch points out that the grammatically feminine Syriac word ruha, which means Holy Spirit, was arbitrarily changed to be a masculine noun, as the Spirit was seen to have female qualities. And the female apostle Junia was changed to a man in later versions of the book of Romans. McCulloch also explains that Mary Magdalene had perhaps too much of a nod to women in authority and became something of a symbol of challenge to patriarchal rule. Certainly the followers of Montanus included influential women who were swept aside with the rest of their co-religionists as the institutional church became more codified certainly because of their beliefs as their systems were counseled out of existence, regardless of their gender. But again, as movements such as that of Montanus were popular with women, women as leaders naturally would start to disappear once that movement also started to disappear. So as the emerging hierarchy cataloged its orthodoxy down to the few options that we have today, it also eliminated traces of female enfranchisement that were part of those systems. As Christianity became codified, we see the institutional church relegating women then to gain influence and fame only in very prescribed roles. We see the result of women losing some of this authority. Later famous women seem to fall into several categories. One is the martyr, Joan of Arc, one of the exclusive roles open to women when martyrdom was an option. Or alternatively, as the cloistered visionary, whose lives approach a state of martyrdom and are only significant because of the extremity that they evince. We have Julian of Norwich, who probably just lived in a little house next to a church, but there are many stories of her actually being walled up inside of a church and living her existence, having food passed to her through a hole. And St. Teresa of Avila, whose ecstasy is marked by being run through by an angel's spear. These images of martyrdom still set women out as being authoritative because those are options where they are able to maintain the role of martyr. Even in modern Eastern Orthodoxy, one of the jokes based very much on fact is that women are not allowed behind the altar, behind the royal doors, unless, of course, they're vacuuming. The third point is that even with the examples of strength and leadership that women in the early church provided, that we have evidence of, I think it can be argued that women never really had the degree of enfranchisement that some examples indicate. We look at the women who are witness to the crucifixion. Certainly the gospel writers give them the prestige of being present and of being present at the resurrection, but the men don't believe them. I think that Pastor Nadia Boltz-Weber, who some of you might be familiar with, as she describes one of her more recent tattoos, is the women coming to inform the cloistered disciples that they have seen the risen Christ. And the women are holding up a finger saying, no, just shut up a minute and let us tell you, because the men don't believe the message that they brought. So the women are fighting to get their point across. When Mary of Bethany shows her great devotion by washing the feet of Jesus with her tears, this act is rejected even by another woman, her sister Martha, who complains that Mary's not living up to her woman's duties as the host of these guests that they have. Mary of the eponymous Gospel of Mary is openly challenged by Peter, another example of a woman with great authority rubbing male colleagues the wrong way in their assumption of authority. With Perpetua, who, like Lady Macbeth and Queen Elizabeth, needs to be established in her narrative as somehow being manly. So she has a vision of herself transformed into a man in preparation for combat. Perpetua and other field martyrs must openly reject both men and women, such as Thecla's mother and Thecla's fiancé, who seem more concerned about them not fulfilling their societal roles than them actually having become Christians. So these things show an extra layer of resistance to conversion, to Christianity, that men don't have to face. So we can see, I believe that women actually never had quite the extent of power that they might have if they had not been through the prejudice against them as women in the very air that they breathe. So in conclusion, a few thoughts. We don't hear Perpetua or most of the other martyrs in history because in the end she's another example of martyrdom among many, many, many examples. And as I've tried to point out, being a woman wasn't necessarily something that set you apart, except in great extremity. She is in the end another character from Shakespeare, like Viola, like Cleopatra, like Rosalind, and others who as a woman has to deny her own gender in order to gain influence in the situation that she's in, regardless of her worth in the eyes of God. And I think that this implies very strongly to the leadership of the church and to us who are planning to take leadership roles, that we need to be explicit, truly explicit, in directing the message of the gospel to all of our hearers, and in encouraging active membership and leadership among all of our populations, women and everyone else. The hierarchy of the past, in living out the norms of societies of the past, has built-in exclusions that still exist in our church. And now as a church, we actively must work to overcome such exclusions. Thank you very much.